Who? When? Where? How? And why? Understanding our past helps us see patterns that might otherwise be invisible in the present. Welcome to History Reports channel.
This story starts with one uncontrollable horse, and the Emperor Michael III attempting to tame it. After many failed attempts, the emperor sank into a dark depression and resorted to heavy drinking. When in such state, everyone around him was facing a deadly fate, as Emperor Michael was capable of brutal acts, including sudden executions at times when frustrated or provoked. The emperor preferred to chase and ride beautiful horses than dealing with the monotonous affairs of the state. Facing a considerable risk, one of his entourage stepped forward, telling the emperor that one of his employees, a gifted peasant from Macedonia called Basil, might be able to tame the horse. The emperor immediately ordered him to summon the peasant, a young man of 22. Noticing that this young peasant had a magnificent physique and strength, and a great presence about him, under the emperor's sharp gaze, Basil stepped toward the horse. The confrontation between this man and a wild horse was an amazing event to watch. With one extraordinarily powerful hand, Basil grabbed the bridle of the plunging horse and by main force, compelled the stallion to stand still. Next, with his other free hand, he reached up, gripped the quivering animal's ear and spoke into it in a low voice. It took only a moment, and then, as if by some celestial order, the wild horse was transformed into a tame and obedient servant. Emperor Michael, or Michael the Drunkard, as he would be later known, so descriptively, was immediately driven from the deepest anger and frustration to euphoria. Shouting with elation, he decided to draft this young peasant into his personal service as a member of the Imperial Palace Guard. And by this simple solitary act, Michael unwittingly set in motion a series of events that ultimately would lead to some of the greatest achievements of the second, longest-lived dynasty in its 1,000-year history, and to his own assassination. Less than a decade after Basil's astonishing triumph of horse breaking, the illiterate peasant from Macedonia would step across the dead body of his master to assume the imperial throne and launch the second golden age of Byzantium. For almost 2 centuries thereafter, while the lights of civilization faintly glimmered in Western Europe, the magnificence of Byzantine would continue to blaze with a brilliant splendor from the east. There, an extraordinary mixture of peoples, who were called Greeks by Western Europeans, Romans, and by Middle Eastern Arabs, utilized a number of different and amazing set of forces and values, the efficient military and civil authority that was the legacy of the old Roman Empire, the rich cultural heritage of classical Greece, the robust spirituality of the Christian Church, and the enormous wealth supplied by the empire's strategic position astride of the vibrant trade routes between Asia and Europe. However, a number of difficulties accompanied these convenient benefits. The great legions of the enormous bureaucracy required to administer the provinces were not only very expensive, but a breeding ground of corruption and conspiracies. In addition to this, the Church was wrecked by disputes between the Pope in Rome and the Patriarch in Constantinople, and it was torn by frequent, turbulent battles between theological factions, each of which claimed exclusive possession of the truth and considered all opponents to be heretics. As for the wealth that infused the empire, it was a magnet for less fortunate, but ever ambitious enemies eager to improve their lot through war and conquest. Despite these problems, the Byzantine Empire persevered, at times driven into retreat, at times expanding throughout the known world, and at times forged anew and rediscovered unity. In doing this, the Byzantines preserved some of the highest achievements of human society, most particularly the Greek culture that elsewhere had been trampled into the dust to await a later Renaissance. Yet, the Byzantines accomplished a lot more than perseverance and preservation. They achieved a remarkable fusion of East and West, of old and new, of pragmatism and mysticism, whose like had never been seen before. Even before his golden opportunity with the emperor, the man who would be known as Basil the Macedonian had experienced more than a little good luck. His origins were crude. He had been born in 836 to a poverty-stricken parents who were barely surviving on a small tract of land near Adrianople. As a restless youth, he had fled provinces to find his fortune in Constantinople. At the time, the Byzantine capital had celebrated its 500th birthday, having been inaugurated by the Emperor Constantine in 330 as his new imperial seat. Until then, the settlement located along the waterway that divided Europe from Asia had been known as Byzantium, in commemoration of its founder, a Greek colonizer Byzas. It was in this city's vast rolling sea of people that the young Basil exhibited resiliency from the very first day when he arrived from his village in Macedonia. His good luck was apparent from the moment when he made his way through the Constantinople's Golden Gate and finding a shelter among the ordinary, impoverished, and homeless people in nearby church. That same evening, he met and befriended monk Nicholas. Through Nicola's brother, who was a physician, Basil would secure a job of a groom in the employ of a rich nobleman. No one was indifferent to Basil's charisma, his hunting ability, and physical skills in general. It didn't take long before Basil became his employer's favorite. And when Courtier was sent on a mission to Peloponnesus, he took Basil along with him. On this fateful journey, Basil's good luck followed him once again. There, he would catch the eye of an astoundingly wealthy widow, called Daniels. She was so fascinated by Basil that she lavished him with gifts, which included anything from wardrobe to gold and slaves. Not too long after this, Basil would perform his art of taming a wild horse and captivate the emperor, who welcomed him into the imperial household. Quite clearly, Basil became noticed and successful largely because of his physical strength and abilities. Overnight, he found himself entangled with plots of jealousies that were continually breaking out among the members of the emperor's court. And once again, he proved to be just as skillful in handling his enemies as he was in handling horses. Also, his luck never abandoned him. A harsh animosity grew between the imperial high chamberlain and the Emperor Michael's uncle Bardas, the Caesar. It was an unequal contest, in which not only blood relations were involved, but the position of Caesar made Bardas the designated successor to the imperial throne. Surpassed on all fronts, the chamberlain lost his post, and even more tragically, he lost his freedom. His replacement was no other than Basil. Basil's position was further cemented when the emperor chose to revise his and Basil's domestic arrangements. This was rather a complicated affair. Both men were married. Basil was married to a woman from Macedonia, and the emperor was married to an empress, chosen for him by his mother when he was 17 years old. Michael, however, preferred the company of his mistress Eudocia and Gerina. In order to legitimize her presence at his court, the emperor concocted a plan which would require Basil to divorce his wife and marry Eudocia. Furthermore, to compensate for the loss of Basil's wife, and the fact that Eudocia would continue to sleep with the emperor, Michael arranged for his sister Thesia to become Basil's mistress. And while the emperor was preoccupied with love affairs and personal hobbies, endless difficulties besieged his empire, despite the fact that it was managed with a firm hand and shrewd mind of his uncle Bardas. Years earlier, when Michael was still in his teens and impatient to be rid of his nagging mother and two regents, his uncle, Bardas, took advantage of this situation. He conspired with Michael to seize control of the throne. The plot ended with the murder of the principal regent and the banishment of the empress, Michael's mother, to a convent. Michael came out of this unburdened and too happy to leave the bothersome business of government to his uncle Bardas. Despite all his brutality, Bardas proved to be a surprisingly dedicated and incorruptible administrator. The first 10 years since he rose to power was the prosperous period, full of accomplishments. He founded a great university at the Magnora Palace in Constantinople and gathered there the most prominent thinkers of this time. Under his guidance, the word of Christ and the power of Byzantium were actively exported to infidel lands. Converting his neighbors to Christianity brought many benefits, such as profitable trade agreements. Bardas was successful almost everywhere. Byzantine wealth was shaded only by a deepening rift between the Western Church and Rome, by never-ending battles with Arab raiders from the south, and by a new threat that abruptly appeared in 860. One June afternoon, when Bardas accompanied his nephew, Emperor Michael, in a campaign against the Arabs, a great fleet of 200 longships sailed into the Sea of Marmura. They belonged to Vikings who had previously conquered the Slavic tribes of the northwestern Asia and had settled in the regions around Kiev. Although they were known as Varangians, they referred to themselves as Rusi, and later on they would become known as Russians. At the same time, there were many internal problems that preoccupied Bardas' mind, but one of his greatest concerns was Michael's growing enchantment with Basil. After all, this Macedonian peasant had become high-ranking chamberlain. For all his wisdom and success, Bardas was always subject to the emperor's whim, and he doubted Michael's long-term stability. As the time will show later, all his fears were well-founded. In the spring of 866, while he and Michael were preparing to lead an expedition against the Saracens, who were based on Crete, Basil convinced the emperor that his uncle Bardas was plotting against him. As Bardas was inspecting army preparedness, Basil and his henchmen suddenly surrounded the old Caesar and hacked him to death in the very presence of his nephew, who consented to the killing, but felt himself endangered by the sudden violence of the attack. Now the emperor had no other ally but Basil, and he clung to him even closer than before. He gave Basil all powers that had been exercised by Bardas. However, this was not enough for the Basil's growing ambition. During elaborate ceremonies, in May of 866, in magnificent Hagia Sophia, the Emperor Michael astonished everyone when he proclaimed that Basil would be the guardian and manager of his empire, and his co-emperor. And just like Bardas, Basil demonstrated a remarkable inclination for rule. Moreover, Basil also could not help but think that his fate depended on the emperor's goodwill. His new gained power was not permanent or equal to that held by the emperor. Basil was well aware that Michael's behavior was erratic, especially when he drank, and he drank often. In his drunken rages, which he could not remember the next day, the emperor ordered executions of innocent people, whose only sin was to pass in front of the emperor's menacing eyes. To compensate for his excessive spending, the emperor confiscated church and private property, melting down irreplaceable works of art for their gold content. Within the first few months of his rise to power, Basil had a chance to see a chilling sign of Michael's whim. While celebrating a horse race he had won, Michael responded to compliments of a new acquaintance by inviting him to remove Michael's royal red boots and don them himself. Basil objected, and Michael turned on him in fury. "I made you an emperor, and have I not the power to create another emperor if I will?" Basil was not about to convince himself that this was nothing. Unlike Bardas, he knew better. On a cold raining September evening in 867, Basil was summoned to dine with the emperor at the Palace of St. Mamas, which was the imperial residence located across the Golden Horn from Constantinople. When Michael drank himself to the point of passing out, Basil slipped away to the emperor's bedroom, where he disabled the bolts that locked the door. He then returned and helped Michael to bed as he had done many times in the past. Soon, he was back, but not alone. He was accompanied by 8 co-conspirators. The terrified Kurdur alone could not protect Michael. One of the men slashed at the unconscious emperor and succeeded in cutting off both of his hands. Then, while the bleeding emperor lay helplessly, moaning and cursing in his bed, the conspirators debated whether they ought to finish him off. At some point, one of them delivered a final, fatal stab. The assassins then rode through the storm across the Golden Horn, and in the night took possession of the great palace, to which they were admitted by an accomplice. Therefore, with stealth and murder, began the second golden age of Byzantium. Basil, a peasant without any education or formal training, and only limited experience, had overthrown the emperor, and marked the beginning of one epoch. At his time, Byzantium was on the verge of financial ruin, religious schism, and holy war with Islam. Basil had only his common sense to guide him through these troubled times. From the beginning, Basil was obsessed with palace plotters. Some of them were angry relatives and friends of the late emperor. But later he did enjoy broad support among the nobility, the army, the citizenry, and the Senate. Despite the brutal murder of the emperor, everyone supported Basil mainly because it was generally understood that the empire had been in mortal danger for a long time. Michael's wild spending had completely emptied the treasury. Basil knew that he was facing an urgent problem, but he didn't wish to accomplish this by imposing heavier taxation. And he especially didn't wish the peasant farmers to pay the heavy price, as he never forgot the toils of a farmer. Therefore, he chose to solve this problem with fairness and justice. Instead of raising taxes, he strove to make their collection uniform and just. He dealt severely with corrupted officials and greedy landowners, while doing everything possible to make sure that no poor farmer was driven from his land by taxation. He made sure that the rate of taxation was expressed in clear figures so that taxpayers could understand what was expected of them. He also began the monumental revision of the Justinian Code. 3 centuries had passed since the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I had recodified Roman civil law, and revisions were now clearly in order. In a relatively short time, imperial purse was replenished and the population noticed a distinct improvement in the quality of government. But there were still many problems across Basil's path, which also included a crisis of religion. Just little over 2 decades earlier, during the regency of Michael's mother Theodora, the church had emerged from a racking schism precipitated by a movement known as iconoclasm. Its adherents had declared that the wide use of religious pictures, icons, and worship amounted to idolatry. For a time, the Byzantine emperors had sided with iconoclasts and had participated in wholesale destruction of religious art and artifacts. But the respecters of icons had eventually won out, and in 843, a council of reunification had put an end to the strife. This period was marked with great demand for new works to replace those destroyed. Thus, Byzantium experienced glorious resurgence of art, which would be called the Macedonian Renaissance, in honor of Basil and his descendants. And by 870, the religious peace was restored, and the relations between the Byzantine and Roman churches were settled, at least for a while. The only thing that remained unsettled was the raging Holy War since 634, when the Muslims had first burst forth from Arabia and invaded the Byzantine territory of Syria. In the more than 2 centuries since then, the Arabs had greatly reduced the Byzantine Empire in the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe. During 870s, Basil continually attacked an Arab world that was in considerable disarray because of internal dissension. Simultaneously, he fought battles against the infidels in Asia Minor and in Italy, and in central Mediterranean. He was successful in the east, but not in the west, where he lost the strategically important island of Malta and great city of Syracuse in Sicily. Basil had somewhat increased the overall possessions of Byzantium, while he prepared his oldest son Constantine to succeed him. Basil ruled until 886, when he was killed in a bizarre accident. He didn't die of human hand. While hunting, a huge deer impaled Basil on its antlers and carried him off, fatally injuring him. This time, his good luck had abandoned him, but the greatness of the Macedonian dynasty and the Byzantine Empire did not end here. It continued to exist many centuries afterward. And the story about an extraordinary peasant from Macedonia who became the Byzantine emperor will live on forever.